Thank you very much for having me. I mean, it's been a great 3 days. I gave a version of this talk on, I guess it was Monday now, to the students. So for those of you, I see some familiar faces already. Hopefully something new will come through, or at least you'll have more questions. So sorry for the repetition. So Alain had already introduced me, but I thought I'd give you a little bit more information about myself. So I've been at Neuron since 2000, so it's 14 years, which is way longer than the editorial half-life and probably longer than I expected when I started, but it's been a great place for me. I've seen lots of changes just in the time that I've been there, and I imagine that there'll be far more to come because publishing is really in a kind of time of upheaval right now, which I think has some negative consequences, but I think also a lot of positives as technology is coming in and really changing the game. So the talk I'm going to give today, the major goal I have is to really open up the black box of publishing and to kind of take you from that place where I know most of you have been, where you've spent years working on a project, you're really excited by the results, there's some anticipatory dread as you're starting to think about publishing, and a lot of questions, and eventually a lot of anxiety. Your paper goes into the review process, and usually there's this at least month-long period where I think the anxiety is really, really, really mounting, and then probably crescendos when you get the decision. And some of that I think is just a natural part of a process like this, where decisions are being made and kind of fates are turning. But some of it I think is just kind of the mysteriousness of the process itself. And so my goal is to kind of open that up to you. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you the tricks that are automatically going to get your paper into Neuron or any other journal, but maybe you'll learn something that will at least kind of open your eyes to what's going on in the process. One caveat that I give is I'll tell you a lot of things that I think are true for many journals, maybe even all journals. There are some things I'm going to talk about that are really only true for Neuron and Cell Press, and I'm only speaking on behalf of Neuron and Cell Press. And I'll try to point out places where there are differences, because one of the things that I really would like you to come away with is that not all journals are alike. There are big differences between journals, and that you should be a consumer about where you send your work. The structure, just put down a little bit of the structure. I'll give you some background on Cell Press and Neuron. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the stage at which you're trying to decide where to submit, because I think this is actually a critical stage that often people maybe go in with a lot of kind of voodoo magic about where they're going to go to next with their paper, and it really makes a big difference as to sort of where you spend your time, and I think that's the one precious commodity that few of us have. So picking the right journal so that you get into the right process, I think is a really important part of getting your paper published in the end, obviously. I'll talk about submissions, pre-submission inquiries, and cover letters, why they matter, when they matter, whether they matter, the path of a typical submitted paper to Neuron. I know most of you have gotten decision letters, probably have spent a lot of time reading the tea leaves between the lines of editor speak, so I'll talk a little bit about navigating those decision letters, about the rebuttals and appeals process, so when to think about appealing and when to move on. And then at the end, I have kind of like a little collection of tips and maybe kind of personal musings on things that I think would be great for authors to think about as they're navigating not just the publishing process, but sort of the practice of science. That last part I think will be a lot of kind of, personal things that sort of stand out to me today in 2014, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about. So some background on Neuron and Cell Press. So Neuron, it's part of Cell Press. Cell Press is, I think it's 40 years old this year. Cell was the first journal in the Cell Press family. It was launched by Benjamin Lewin, and Neuron was the second journal. We just had our 25th anniversary. The family of Cell Press has really grown, especially in the last 10 years. We're now up to 13 research journals, including the most recent, which is Cell Reports. It's an open access title. A number of society titles, 3 currently, and that's constantly expanding. And we brought in the Trends Reviews titles about 7 years ago. So we have sort of a fleet of review journals as well. All Cell Press titles are professionally, well, most of them, but pretty much all, are professionally edited by PhD staff editors. And this is kind of a big topic of discussion in the field these days about the relative merits of professional versus academic editors. And I think there's probably pluses and minuses of both systems. But at Neuron Cell Press, our only job is to be editors. We're not running labs. We don't have other jobs. presumably sort of we're not aligned with a particular field really anymore, other than, at Neuron, neuroscience generally, and colleagues at other journals with their fields generally. And we have editorial boards for our journals. So this is also a difference between journals. Not all journals have editorial boards. Nature, for instance, doesn't have editorial boards for most of their journals. Science has a board of reviewing editors. Editorial boards at different journals work differently. At Neuron, they're advisors only. So they have no access to any of our systems, any of the data. They don't know which papers are coming through. They're involved in reviewing papers and would obviously know about those papers, but are no more kind of privy to information than anybody else. And this often comes up because sometimes people will tell me, well, I didn't submit that paper to Neuron because you have so-and-so on your ed board, and I didn't want them to know about my paper. Well, just so you know, they're not going to know about it. Neuron itself has 8 PhD editors, so kind of a small group for a large workload. We are published twice a month online and in print, but pretty much the number of people who get print issues of the journal is, minuscule. Everything is online, really. The company does a lot of work to kind of estimate sort of readership, and since we no longer have a lot of personal subscriptions, the way you estimate that is things like downloads and clicks on the website. But the estimate is that if your paper is published in Neuron, you'd have about 25,000 readers who would be looking at it. Our monthly downloads, every month they go up. At 400,000, I think, is an old number. They're probably up to 5 now. So the bottom line is if you publish in Neuron, lots of people will see your paper. That includes scientists, but also there's a lot of the lay press, policymakers, clinicians, all sorts of people. It kind of surprises me when I meet people who read Neuron. I met one of my neighbors who's a physicist reads Neuron. Our scope is broad, so we started as a molecular cellular journal, so focusing on molecular cellular neuroscience, physiology, ion channels, and have, now 15 plus years really been expanding towards systems, cognitive theory, preclinical translational work. It is surprising to me that people still sort of pigeonhole us as a molecular cellular journal. In fact, probably if you look at the journal now, the molecular cellular and developmental neurobiologists have something to complain about because far less of the journal is occupied by that space than it used to be. But the bottom line is we're broad. The aim is to be interesting and readable to all neuroscientists. I'd also mention, I've already mentioned the editorial board and that they're advisory. We receive about 2,000 papers per year, about 180 new submissions every month. And we peer review about 50 to 60% of that. So this is one area which I'll talk about a little bit later, so that most journals now don't send all papers out for review. It's pretty much impossible no matter what journal you are. And it's sort of a drain, I think, on reviewer pools to send out papers that may not have the potential that you need to make it through review. So there's some decision made at every journal as to how many papers they're going to review. I think the number of 50 to 60% is actually quite generous. So our philosophy at Neuron has been sort of, when in doubt, send it out. So I am much more concerned about losing a good paper because I or my staff didn't recognize it than holding back a bad one that would be caught by the rest of the process. That number, I can't tell you what other journals' numbers are because it's not something that most journals put on their websites, but it's something that you should know and figure out about the journals where you submit because it can vary widely. I suspect that Nature, the number is more down to like 10%. So, an important number to kind of know as you're thinking about where you want to submit. Our final acceptance rate is about 10 to 15%, but there's no quota. So, I, as editor-in-chief, I kind of have to manage flow of papers so that we're not one year publishing 800 papers and the next year 300, but within that there's some range. And so we don't have a 10 to 15% cutoff, so when we reach the 15%, we don't say no more papers. It's really kind of an ebb and flow that you monitor as an editor, but it has been around 10 to 15% for quite a while. Most of our papers are revised. It's pretty rare that I have a paper that goes through that is just perfect. I had one last week. It was very exciting for everyone involved. Our policy has been the last number of years to really limit papers to one round of revision. We will rarely make an exception to allow a third round, but that would usually be at that point, we're going to accept your paper, we just are cleaning things up. So most papers would require one round of revision, but not necessarily a full review in the second round. Sometimes they're editorially reviewed. And we have a close relationship with other Cell Press titles. So that means that we are by and large all in one office. There's about 55 professional editors at Cell Press. We have, the journals are run independently, so I don't know what's going through Cell, and I don't have access to their system in any detailed way, but we have the ability to take transfers from Cell, and we can co-review papers with Cell or with any of their self-press titles, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, sort of what the kind of costs and benefits of either transfer or co-submission are. But the bottom line is, you should consider the staffs of the individual journals as independent. Sometimes people think, well, let me tell you about why I'm mad at you for that decision at Cell. I'm not responsible for decisions at Cell, so you should talk to the editors at Cell. So as a first step, when you have your paper, you've spent years working on this project, you're trying to decide where to submit, you probably have multiple options. Choosing where to submit, I think, is just a big kind of decision-making point where you can really kind of force the trajectory of where you're going next. And one thing that I see probably too often is a sort of philosophy where people try, well, I'm going to aim super high on everything, and I'm just going to watch it trickle down. It's not uncommon at all at Neuron for us to get papers that have been through 2 or 3 journals, which is kind of shocking because I think Neuron's a very good journal, and it's rarely something that doesn't come at a cost for the investigator. Usually the level of stress and kind of anxiety about timing is quite high by the time you've been to the 2nd or 3rd journal. So I think thinking about where your paper would fit best, where the process would fit best for you, and where you can kind of maximize your time and your energies, I think is an important part of just starting the submission process. So, I mean, the most obvious thing is to fit the scope of your paper to the scope of the journal. So obviously, with Neuron, we're interested in most of neuroscience, but occasionally we have papers that come to us because somehow they're looking at a process that happens to be in neurons, but really the scope of the paper is much more interesting to, say, stem cell or molecular cell, and it's just not a good fit for neurons. So I think one thing you can look at is, so do you see other papers like yours in the journal that you're looking at, whether it's Neuron or another journal? And if you don't, it doesn't mean the journal's not interested, but you might want to sort of then contact an editor or look a little bit more closely, because certainly there's papers that we reject every month that it's purely out of scope, and you sort of wasted your time in submitting at that point. I think sort of thinking about as objectively as you can the relative significance and potential impact of the advance. Sort of for journals like Neuron, Cell Science, Nature, sort of high-profile journals, I mean, the reality is we are making a part of the judgment based on significance and advance. It's not just a technical review. And so trying to figure out kind of how to calibrate, so is it significant and important enough? Where should I aim? I think is a really, again, important step here. So it's good to reach high, but I think you want to also be realistic. At the same time, I certainly have worked with authors who maybe weren't reaching high enough, right? Who were sending their papers to journals and flying into the journals that they were getting into, but maybe with a little bit more effort they could have gone to a different type of journal if that's what they were interested in. So being objective about that, or potentially getting advice on perceived impact. It's worth looking at kind of other logistical factors that you might need to consider. So if you're in a hurry, or if you are really constrained in how many more experiments you could do or how many revisions you could do, you should keep that in mind as you're thinking about journals. If you know that the journal that you're interested in tends to have a revision process or has standards that would sort of require a revision process, and you don't have the ability to make revisions, say because your postdoc has left or because you've moved on, that might end up being sort of a limiting factor when you submit. So things like timing constraints, also competition. If you're really hot and heavy to get this thing out now, thinking about the general timing that the review process takes of the journal would be important. Other factors about kind of the format of journal articles and the style that matter to you. And here I think it becomes quite personal and maybe specific to the story. So if you have a paper that's really a paper that's going to benefit most from a long format, well, then Nature and Science might be difficult journals for you to really tell your story in the way that you want to tell it. Neuron, I mean, one of the things I think we're most generous about is length and number of figures. In fact, we try to make it work with authors. But again, that's not going to be ideal for every story. The style of the review process, again, a very personal decision. So if you are somebody who really doesn't want your work judged on advance and impact, well, then you may not be wanting to submit to journals like Cell Science, Nature, Neuron, but there are journals, PLOS One is one example where it's technical reviews only, and that's certainly a viable way to publish your work. The length of the review and revision process and the editorial style, and I think this is kind of a point I'll make a lot throughout the rest of the talk, is editorial styles at journals vary widely, and it's sort of worth your time to sort of figure out what that style is and how it fits your own style, and decide sort of where the match is. So how involved and accessible are the editors? Are you going to be able to get the information that you need? Maybe you're not looking for that kind of hands-on interaction with an editor, and then another journal would be equally appropriate. So those kinds of things about editorial style, I think, are a little harder to figure out just from looking at journal websites, but I think often talking to your colleagues or thinking about your own experiences can be helpful. And then, for a lot of people, the publication model matters a lot. So if you really feel strongly about having your work be open access, there are journals for that, but it's not going to be every journal. Likewise, if you feel very strongly about your journal not being a for-profit journal or being a society journal, that's also something to think about. I mentioned already editorial style of the journal, and this is kind of a theme I'll weave through. And I think this mostly comes just also from personal advice. This is kind of a hard one to get your hands on, but I think it matters just a huge amount. And I would encourage you all to sort of be consumers about your work. I think a lot of the time authors think, well, I don't have any power, and it's the editors who have all the power, and there's nothing really that I can decide here. And I would kind of ask you to sort of flip that. The reality is the journals have to publish, and we want to publish good work. And if you do good work, we want to publish your good work. So we actually spend a lot of time kind of following scientists' work and at times recruiting work and encouraging people to submit to us. So, you can be a consumer there, and you have your choices, and I would just encourage you to kind of take advantage of that where you can. If you're unsure, especially for younger investigators, you may not have had a lot of experiences with the journals that you're interested in, either personally or through the labs that you're in. Then ask colleagues for advice. Get people to sort of share their experiences with you. Of course, you have to kind of see that through a lens. If you're going to ask somebody about a journal and the journal had just rejected their paper, they're probably going to be in a less positive mood than somebody who was accepted. But I think if you collect all of that up, it starts to give you a picture. You can consider sending a pre-submission inquiry to the journal to assess their interest. So if you have your selection of journals that you're interested in, you can send, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail later, about when it's appropriate, an email with abstract to the journal editors to basically ask, would they be interested in this particular paper? It is perfectly fine, actually, to submit pre-submission inquiries to multiple journals. It is not perfectly fine to submit your paper to multiple journals, so this is a good time to kind of play the field. And then the last thing, and I purposely put it at the bottom of the thing, is just impact factor and kind of citation index obsessions. And I get the fact that since in a lot of places, including here, I assume that impact factors of journals matter a lot for kind of professional evaluations. So you have to consider them to some degree, but I kind of urge you to look at the bigger picture as well. I often kind of hear too much about people sort of chasing the highest impact factor journal at great expense of time and money, and the thing that you kind of have to ask yourself is, what else could you have done with that time and money? So, I think the days of kind of even academic sort of hiring committees being focused on impact factors are probably changing. They're still there now, but I'd encourage you to kind of think beyond the impact factors. So submitting your paper, I mentioned that one option that you have is a pre-submission inquiry, and all this really is an email that you would send to the journal. There's usually an address on the journal website, or you could send it to an individual editor at Neuron, and that just basically summarizes your paper, usually includes an abstract. You can ask any questions you want, but kind of the gist of it is, would this be a paper that the journal would be interested in at least reviewing? And one question is sort of when, are they a good idea? Do they work? Are there times when they're not a good idea? And I think pre-submission inquiries, like in the days of now online review, there's a window of time, you can call it a critical period, where it's reasonable to send a pre-submission inquiry, and there's a point in time where it's just not useful. So if you have the paper ready to go, it's on your desktop, and you're about to hit submit, do not send a pre-submission inquiry. You might as well submit the paper at that point and the editor could see the whole thing. But a better stage for it would be if you're further back, so maybe you're just about to write up and you're thinking about, okay, which journal might I go to? How would I format it? How would I cast the story? Or better yet, even stage before that, where maybe you're at a point where you finished a line of experiments, you could take it in another layer to another set of directions, or you could stop. I mean, that's another good place to ask editors. And all you'd be getting at this stage is kind of advice. So it doesn't mean the journal's going to publish your paper for sure, but they can tell you whether they're going to review it usually, and also point out any areas that you might want to think about. So it wouldn't be uncommon at Neuron, for instance, for somebody to ask me, would you be interested in reviewing this paper? And I might say, I would in principle, but here's some issues that I think are going to come up with the reviewers in this area. They're things that we see the reviewers commonly bring up. And then you can take that advice and think about it and come to Neuron or not. I think the great thing about pre-submission inquiries nowadays are it's a very level field. I think it used to be the perception that there were certain investigators who had kind of the red hotline to the editors, and they got to have all the advice or got to spend all their time appealing their papers. And it's a much, the internet really kind of opens things up. Email opens things up. So there's no barrier there. You don't have to kind of know the editor to send that email. In fact, many journals have the forms on their website, so there's not even an email that you have to send. The next thing that I was going to talk about is cover letters, so whether these matter. And here I've heard that this is my personal opinion on this. I think they matter a lot. And at Neuron, we pay attention to them a lot. But I do know that other editors from other journals who have given this talk, as people have told me, have said exactly the opposite. So you can take this as sort of my personal opinion for why they matter. So the cover letter, what the cover letter gives you is really an opportunity to talk straight to the editor and only to the editor. So reviewers don't see cover letters. The editor and the editorial team would see it. And it's really a place where you can kind of put down whatever you think might be important that's not in the paper that you want an editor to kind of have a handle on. And for different papers and different authors, that may include different things. So one thing I've seen people do is they use the cover letter to kind of describe some of the sociology of the field. So if there's kind of big camps, you can lay out to an editor, well, here's kind of the camps, this is sort of where we sit. You can even lay out who's in those camps. And that can be really useful information for an editor to, at the end of the day, sort of evaluate the reviews that come back. You can use the cover letter to kind of, in a more bold-faced way, talk about why you think the work is significant and important in a way that maybe kind of you don't want to do in the paper itself. You want the paper to tell people why it's important, but I think most people are hesitant to come off as being sort of too braggarty about their work in the paper. Whereas in cover letter to the editor, you can kind of lay it all out and tell us sort of what you think. The cover letter is also a good time to tell us about constraints that you might have. And this can be really, really important. So if somebody tells me, listen, we know we have competition, or my postdoc is leaving at the end of the month, I'd really appreciate if you can get this reviewed quickly. To the extent we can, we would, but I have to know about it. Likewise, if in advance that, okay, look, we're sending this paper to you. We know that the experiments will be better if we had a knockout in vivo set of experiments, but we're not going to be able to do that. It doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily overrule that concern, but I can have that in my mind as I'm either deciding to send it out or when the reviews come in. So kind of giving the editor sort of a lay of the land for yourself can help us sort of do better on the review process. You can also use the cover letters to rule out or suggest reviewers, and there's also forms on the submission form. And at Neuron and at Cell Press in general, you are allowed to rule out 3 reviewers, no questions asked. So you don't need to tell us why. People, for some reason, do not believe this. They constantly think, not only am I not going to rule out people, but I think you use the rule outs to choose reviewers, and so I'm going to... we're just not that nefarious. So if you rule out 3 people, it doesn't matter why, because they're your arch personal enemy or because they're working on the same project. We'll abide by the 3. If you go beyond the 3, there may be questions. So a little bit beyond the 3 is okay. Ruling out all of Harvard, which somebody had tried, or all of postsynaptic LTP, which others have tried, that's not going to work. So just be reasonable. And the same thing goes for suggesting. So shockingly, people don't want to suggest because they think that we're not going to then pick the suggested. Honestly, we don't have enough time to play games like this. And I find the suggested incredibly useful. So I might not use the suggested for your paper, but certainly if there's somebody that we would normally use or are thinking of who's on the suggested, I wouldn't not use them for that reason. And where the suggested have been really helpful to us is if you start seeing the same person suggested over and over again, and it's not somebody that we're aware of, for instance, if they're a younger investigator, we start to take that really seriously, and we'll think about bringing them into the reviewer pool. And so one of the things that we've been working on, and we have several kind of active projects at Neuron, is to bring more younger people into, younger in scientific years, you don't have to actually be young, people who are fresh to us into the reviewer pool, and that has been an important mechanism. So don't be afraid to suggest people. Here I think it does become helpful to tell us why. So I would like to suggest this person because they're an expert in X, Y, and Z technique, that kind of thing. I should say that probably most journals have, certainly all Cell Press journals, but even outside of Cell Press, I think most journals have policies on exclusions and suggestions that are on their websites. And I would be surprised if a journal says they allow exceptions on their website that they don't, or that they're going to sort of violate that. So take that up as an option, because I think it can be a useful option in some cases. Writing the paper. So here, this should be so obvious, but you should really think about the journal and the journal style when you're writing the paper. And I don't necessarily mean kind of the style of the references. It happens all the time, at least at Neuron, that we get things that are referenced in a science or nature style, and we never reject it because of that or send it back even because of that. That might not be true at other journals. I think there's other journals where there's more of an administrative end, where if it's not in the right reference style, you're going to have it kicked back to you, and I don't think you want that. But other things that we see that, again, won't cause us not to review the paper, but that can be a little bit frustrating are, say, if it's clearly a previous nature rejection. So it's a short format. We probably, if it's interesting enough, would still review it for Neuron, although you'd probably have to change it down the road if we went forward with it. But it can be the kind of thing that, even if the editor, just sort of rolls their eyes and moves on, that a reviewer gets really pissed off, that they, really don't think that you've taken the time to reformat it according to the journal, that for Neuron and Cell Press, we're really known for kind of scholarly introduction and discussion sections, and if you don't have that, or you're sort of missing the methods, it's not helping you in the eyes of the reviewer. And so it should just be obvious that as you're thinking of formatting for a journal, figure out what the journal formats and styles are and follow that. Related to that, I think, one thing that is also important for kind of most journals at this level, but in particular Neuron and Cell Press, is what we're interested in is, a narrative and a story. And that's not to say that we're interested in kind of fluff around data, but it's more that, our papers aren't just kind of data dumps. Really what we're interested in, and what everybody's interested in, are your interpretations and your analysis and your kind of synthesis. And that is kind of a layer on top of just the data. And you can see this when you read, probably everybody has people in their mind of those authors whose papers you just love to read. And often it's because they have a very good kind of narrative style. They're basically taking you through their arguments where by the end of it, you just can't disagree, right? That's a skill, but it's, I think, a learnable skill. And so I think thinking about your paper as a narrative and intended for a certain kind of audience, and writing it that way instead of just, okay, I have 6 figures, I divide up my data between the 6 figures, and now I'm going to have 6 sections that I will just kind of add together. You can do that, and I think certainly we publish papers that are like that too, but I think the best papers are really ones where you're really seeing the author's interpretation and their voice and their analysis, as opposed to just kind of a summation of the data. When you're writing, you should kind of always think about the message, sort of why is this interesting, why is it important, what do I want the reader to come away with, what have we learned, and keep that in mind. I think it's good to have also other people read your paper, which I think everybody does, but one thing that I think most people do is they'll have everybody in their lab read the paper, which of course is good to do, but the problem with having everybody in your lab read the paper is they've already heard you give, your group meeting talk 17 times over. They already, have filled in the gaps that are in the paper because they already kind of know the story, and they're not going to be the reader who identifies the gaps that you might not even be aware of. I mean, you might maybe already think, oh, well, that's so obvious, I didn't put it into the paper. So I think getting often an outside reader, maybe not somebody who's like from a completely different discipline, but slightly lateral to read your paper can be really helpful for giving that 30,000-foot view, and often identifies kind of gaps that you maybe didn't see yourself that a reviewer might pick up on. So, and kind of to take that message further, I think it's really important to get feedback on your work. And too often, I think nowadays, especially at meetings, you get the impression that nobody wants to present their work outside of, a small group like their lab or a cloistered set of advisors, and they're kind of afraid to present at a meeting before it's published. And, certainly I can see reasons why, especially in some fields, people might have worries of being scooped, and that might be the style of the field, but I think you're losing something when you do that. And one of the things you're losing, I think, is the opportunity to get feedback, for one, from people who might be your reviewers, right? I mean, so it's not uncommon, I think, for people to get questions at meetings that sort of presage the questions they're going to get from the reviewers. Likewise, it gives you kind of a chance to sort of test your story. So how is your narrative kind of hitting the audience? And I think that's also a clue to how it's going to sort of do with the reviewers. So, I think getting feedback is probably one of the most critical things you can do at this stage of the process. And one of the things that you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of become your own toughest reviewer, so that when the tough reviewers do review your paper, they're not going to find anything that you already didn't find, or you're at least not going to be surprised. And often people will ask me sort of, there's these authors, I won't name names, who are, they have these papers, they just seem to like be in Neuron all the time, sort of, why is that? Well, one characteristics that I think successful authors have is, the most successful, I think, have figured this out. They do get a lot of feedback, and they're often harder on themselves than the reviewers are on their papers. And I can see it. There's a handful of people like this where the reviews just aren't that big a surprise. They're filling in relatively minor things, and they've pretty much thought of everything else. They've spent a lot of time sort of polishing this paper. On the other hand, there's other people I can think of who, routinely submit work that's, it's almost there. It's like 90% there, but it's kind of rough, and the reviewers pick up on that. And others who just kind of jump the gun entirely, right? So who end up having, months and months of revisions to sort of close a really interesting story, but maybe if they had spent 3 more months working on experiments, it would have been a more developed story. So try to become kind of your own toughest reviewer, or find people around you who can become that tough reviewer. And the last thing on submission that I wanted to say is something around accuracy. And so this is about things like I'd already mentioned, figure formatting, typos. It's amazing to me, spelling mistakes still happen in days of spell check. Figure formatting errors, just a lot of kind of silly things that shouldn't happen. And the reality is, at the stage of the editor evaluating the paper for review, I'm not going to reject your paper because you have a lot of spelling mistakes, or because you sent the cover letter that says, Dear Nature Editor. But, it's one of those things that I think when there's a lot of kind of inconsistencies or little bitty errors, the editors definitely notice, and the reviewers notice. And I think you can't help as a reviewer or an editor to kind of not take it to the next step, which is, well, if they're this sloppy about submitting, their grand piece of work, how sloppy are they about their science? So it's just kind of an impression that you don't want to leave people with. And I think it can have an effect on reviewer confidence. Like I said, that's not the things that we're looking to reject people for at Neuron, and we'll work with you to fix them. But I think it's sort of not something you want reviewers thinking about. So what happens? So you've decided now you're going to submit a paper, you're going to submit it to Neuron, and I'll just walk you through the process at Neuron. And again, I think this is fairly representative of Cell Press. It probably is similar to processes at other journals and probably differs from even others. So at Neuron, each paper is assigned to one editor, and that editor would become the handling editor throughout the process. They're not the only editor who would look at it. So what happens is we have a daily editorial meeting where everybody on the staff gets a list of all the papers that came in that day with abstracts. We discuss them as a group. We assign them based on different factors. We don't at Neuron specialize, so there's not a synaptic transmission editor and a cognitive editor and a developmental editor. We do each have our expertise, and we probably lean more towards those areas. But we, with 8 editors, we don't have enough editors to cover every area. And most people come to Neuron as editors wanting to kind of read broadly. And so, you shouldn't be worried if your paper comes in and it's handled by somebody who doesn't have a PhD in exactly the area that your paper is from, because that's simply not the way we do it at Neuron, and there's a lot of kind of group consensus around other parts of the process. So that editor would kind of handle the paper. They would consult, especially with me as editor-in-chief, but also with the other editors, and ultimately they would be the one who relays a decision on behalf of the journal. I'd mentioned already that there's this triage stage. Again, this number differs from journal to journal, and it's kind of an important one to get a handle on. And at Neuron, it's 50 to 60% of papers are sent out. The editors would read the paper. They would look at the literature around the paper, often read other papers that relate to your paper, and make a decision initially on whether we're going to review it in the first place. So people are often surprised when they hear that Neuron editors read papers, but we do. There's certainly other journals where that decision on whether your paper gets sent out to review is made more or less based on the abstract. So at Neuron, we look at the abstract, but in the end, we're also looking at the whole paper. So it's not, the abstract is maybe not as big a make or break at Neuron as it might be at other journals, but it's so important in other journals that you should really pay attention to the abstract. And it's kind of shocking how many people don't. Even at Neuron, since that first day, we're kind of going through the list of papers by abstract. Every day there's usually at least one paper where a group of 8 PhDs go, I have no idea what this paper is about from their abstract, so I'll have to read it. That's not an uncommon comment, and that's a shame, because you should be able to tell what the paper's about from the abstract. So the editor would read the paper. They would make an initial evaluation on whether it seems like a good prospect for peer review. If it is, they would pick 3 reviewers usually to review the paper. And if the paper isn't a strong candidate, then their job would be to write a letter to you that communicates why. At this stage, 2 things could happen. So if we're not going to review the paper, one is it's just a kind of a closed door triage rejection, in which case we would just let you know what we felt was missing from the paper. In some cases, we might actually like the paper, like the area that the paper covers, but feel like there's a gap that we feel like needs to be resolved before we can think about reviewing it. And then we would sort of coach you through that and let you know sort of if you did this, then we would consider reviewing it again. So, a reasonable question is, so what are you editors looking for when you're making this decision? Most of these things are probably straightforward, but I'll walk through them. So firstly, we kind of look at what question you're asking and sort of how does it fit in with what is interesting in the field right now. We have at our disposal, obviously, kind of a lot of information about papers that we've reviewed, both successfully and not so successfully, and have a sense of what reviewers and experts in the field think of as being kind of the most important questions and problems. So does the study ask an interesting and important question? Does it change the way we're thinking about a problem, or is it more confirmatory? If it's confirmatory, is it a problem that's been sort of looking for confirmation, because that can be equally important? What specifically is the significance or the advance? Does it somehow take us beyond something we didn't know before? At Neuron, we're certainly interested in anything related to the brain, but in particular we're interested in how the brain works. So mechanism, the bugaboo word that people freak out about, but mechanism means many things. It doesn't necessarily mean molecular mechanism, but mostly at Neuron we're interested in papers, whether it's a developmental paper or a cognitive paper, that tells us something about how the brain works. And so if a paper is, mostly descriptive, that may be sort of less interesting, I think, unless you can kind of take that description and start to sort of poke at mechanism. That doesn't necessarily mean experimentally, maybe how you write the paper. We are also looking for papers that are going to be sort of related to sort of how the brain works under physiological conditions, whatever they are. So that doesn't mean that every paper has to have in vivo, but if you're working in, largely in vitro systems, you need to be making a decent case that the phenomenon that you're looking at is going to be relevant to, an intact system. We do look at experimental design and interpretation, kind of, but broadly, sort of a 30,000-foot view. Are the experiments logically designed? Do you test a hypothesis, or are you just bringing data together that's consistent with the hypothesis? Are the interpretations reasonable from the experiments that you've included? Is there consistency between what you're saying and what the data shows? What we're not doing at this stage is acting as technical reviewers. So we're not going through your paper and sort of poring over the Western blots to see, do the IPs all look perfect? We're not looking at the statistics at this stage. We're looking at kind of big brush picture of whether it seems appropriate to send out for review. We do look at whether the paper is well written and clear, and whether it's accessible for our audience. So it's not uncommon that we might get, so for instance, we're bringing in more theory papers and would love to have more theory in the journal, but it's not uncommon to have theory papers that come in that are kind of incomprehensible to what is still a journal that is largely for experimentalists. So we're looking for papers that if we sent them to reviewers that they could actually read and understand. We don't do any language editing at this stage, and we're not going to not send out a paper because the language or the writing is a bit clunky. But if we think it's sort of beyond clunky, where the language is so difficult that we think, a reviewer's not going to be able to get a clear sense of your message, we would probably come back to you and suggest to you to think about getting some external language editing in place. But the bottom line is that for kind of well-written, clear, and accessible, there's sort of a broad range of what's appropriate for sending it out. And really, if we're sending it back to you at that stage, it's in your benefit. It's not meant to be punitive. And like I said, don't forget to pay attention to the abstract and the cover letter. So I told you already that the Neuron editors, when they send it out, they're not looking at the abstract. But when we invite reviewers, they do see the abstract. And what you want is reviewers to want to review your paper. You can often, editors often talk about this, that you can often tell the papers that are going to be duds or not going to make it by the fact that nobody wants to review it. So you want people to see your abstract, get excited by it, or the best reviewers to see your abstract, get excited by it, and say yes to that invitation. And then, another thing that we look at, which is something that we can't really share with you, is that we have at our disposal kind of all the information about all the other papers that we've ever reviewed. And this gives you a lot. I mean, if there's a paper that we reviewed that's very similar to yours, we have, obviously they're not going to be identical because they're different experimentalists and there may be technical differences. But if a reviewer is telling us, well, this area is just kind of, a little bit more stale than other areas, that might also apply to your paper. Likewise, we may be aware of competition. You may not be aware of competition, but we may have a paper going through that's related to yours, and that gives us some information both as to what those reviewers might be looking for, what would make it a positive review experience on either end, and that might come into play. So, some of the things that we're trying to use kind of that repository of information for is just what's the likelihood that this paper is going to do well in review. And sometimes all that information, that kind of background information, will come together to suggest that it's not really a strong candidate. And the tricky part here is, when, say, there is this sort of background information that we have that sort of factors into your decision, it's not always possible for us to kind of lay that out to you in the decision letter. But it is the kind of thing that where you can maybe ask an editor if there's any confusions and they can maybe help you read between the lines. So the bottom line is at this stage, so when we're thinking about what to review, is we're not looking for the perfect paper. We're looking for a paper that has potential with the assumption that many things could be improved through the review process. So what is the next step? So we've already decided we're going to send your paper out for review. We would pick 3 reviewers. In rare circumstances, we may aim for 3 reviewers and only get 2, either because the timing is difficult or a reviewer doesn't come through. We may end up getting slightly more than 3, say 4 reviewers, if your paper is really complicated and has a lot of different angles that we need to cover. We choose reviewers for a lot of different reasons. I mean, obviously we want people to cover the technical aspects of a paper as well as the conceptual aspects, but we may choose reviewers to kind of give us some consistency with other papers. So if we have reviewed a very similar paper and we want to ensure that the decisions are, not inconsistent, we may ask that same reviewer to review again. We, also try to really get to know our reviewers, and so you kind of have a sense of different reviewer styles, and you also have a sense from that whole pre-evaluation process of what you're looking for. So if you're really unsure about, for instance, the conceptual significance of a paper, you really want to make sure that you have a reviewer on that you really trust their kind of take on the field. Whereas other papers, maybe you're completely sure that it's interesting, but you're really unsure about very specific technical things, and then you may sort of lean more towards technical reviewers. We do screen for biases and potential conflicts of interest. So aside from the people that you rule out, we may rule out people, either because we feel that they're biased in a positive way or in a negative way. So we tend not to send papers to, for instance, people who have trained together or mentors, mentees. Obviously, people who are in the same department, there would be a conflict there. But also people who are kind of wedded to a particular set of ideas, either, in a kind of negative way or in an excessively positive way. So we're looking for people, who are not completely distant from the topic. You don't want people, from another planet, but you want people who can look at the topic objectively. At that point, we would send it out for review, and there's an administrator that we have who kind of helps chase in reviews, but still a lot of work goes in from the editors to really coax the reviews in, because we know reviewers are just really busy. Everyone's very busy right now, and it's often hard to get reviews to come in. People have things that come up professionally or personally that make it difficult for them to review, and so there's just a lot of variables here that usually editors are chasing. We do monitor. People often ask me, like, do you guys review the reviewers? Do you sort of monitor the quality of reviews? And we do, both kind of on a paper by paper basis and then sort of more holistically kind of over a period of time. And definitely if there are reviewers who are either kind of perpetually late or constantly critical, or maybe constantly not critical enough, they're probably not people that we're going to use very often or at all. We also do, as I'd mentioned, we're trying to bring in more actively younger reviewers, and that can take some training too. I mean, less sort of hands-on training, but kind of a relationship building period. So, often people will talk about kind of postdoc reviews. So this would be like the laundry list kind of review. I'm sure you've all had them at one point or another, where something is said and then there's 50 things somebody's asking you to do from top to bottom, and that tends to not be the kind of review we want at Neuron. I mean, we want sort of a big picture, cover the technical things, but not pick the paper apart as if you're in journal club. And that can be something that sometimes you have really good new reviewers who have that tendency, and you just need to kind of train them out of it. And we do certainly work with people to kind of help them develop a style that's more appropriate. So the paper's gone out, and then after the paper's reviewers have submitted their reports back to us, I mean, usually it's still not done for the editors. In some cases, hopefully more cases than not, there's some consistency. So either they all like it or they all don't like it. But the truth is most papers fall in the middle and are split reviews. And then the question is sort of, what does an editor do with that? And often there's some process here, at least at Neuron, that we spend a lot of time going back to the reviewers. So we might ask a critical reviewer why they were so critical, or we might ask one of the more positive reviewers to look at one of the more critical reviewers' comments, and just basically sort of synthesize what's there and take what's a split to something that's a little bit more clear-cut. We will then sort of, once we have all of that, the reviews and any extra reviewer input, the editor, who is the handling editor, is going to make a recommendation, and they would usually write up some notes, potentially bring them to our editorial meeting if it seems like it needs a group's discussion, or they would discuss it with me, and we would make a decision. Sort of, like I said, most decisions are based on split reviews. We are not simply summing the reviews, so we're not just saying, oh, 2 positive, 1 negative, you're in, or the opposite. We're not necessarily looking for consensus either, but we're sort of synthesizing those comments for a direction. there's kind of 3 flavors of decision. You can be kind of accepted right then. That pretty much never happens. Usually there's something. Likewise, there can be sort of a closed door rejection. So, even if you did the technical things that the reviewers pulled out for you, there's probably something about where it sits in terms of conceptual advance and significance that would, still not make it a strong candidate for us. So that would be more of a closed door rejection. And then in between is this kind of space between revise and reject with an open door. And I think this is where a lot of the confusion about the decision letters comes in. And I can tell you sort of what, kind of where our line on that is. So usually if you're invited to revise, what we're then seeing in the reviews is the reviewers are interested in the story. There's some things that you have to do, but they're limited in scope. And it seems likely if you deal with those, and usually we're thinking about limited in scope meaning something like 2 to 3 months, that would be a revision. That would be something that we'd sort of ask you to revise. And you can tell from the letter, our letters at least, that it shows you where to resubmit. It says it's a revision. Slightly, to the left of that is a rejection with a potential open door, which is we might still be interested in the topic, and so it could be very close to a revision, but it's not clear, well, either how much you'd have to do, or how long it's going to take, or how those experiments might pan out. And there, that would be more likely to be sort of a rejection with an open door, and because here I think you have options. So in some cases that can move very quickly to a revise. Maybe there are less experiments than we thought, or you already have the data in your back pocket, or you have arguments that you can make. And in other cases, maybe you just don't have the time. You want to move on, right? And that might be sort of the signal to go someplace else. But bottom line is this sort of line between revise and reject with an open door is a very fuzzy line. And it's not also necessarily even an indicator of quality, depending on where you are on that side of the line. I can tell you every month, we don't label the papers this way, but every month, many of the papers we publish at Neuron were a reject with an open door, and they did more, and they came back, and the paper was vastly improved. So it's not sort of a, all the revises are qualitatively better, the end product is qualitatively better than all of the ones on the open door rejection. It's really more about how far you are from the goal and how much time that would take, and whether you have the ability to do those experiments. So how can you get this letter, and maybe you even figured out whether it's a revise or a reject with an open door, but you still have questions. And so one of the things that I think does distinguish Neuron and Cell Press from other journals is that we really do encourage a dialogue between authors and editors. And I'm not just saying that as a marketing message, it's actually true. We spend, now as kind of manager of a team of people, my team spends probably more time on these kinds of revision discussions, appeals, and rebuttals than pretty much anything else we do. So we do take it very seriously. That's not just altruism. It's how we get good papers in Neuron, and it's how we make what we publish sort of better by working with authors on this stage of the process. And so what this means is, dialogue to me doesn't mean come and argue with me. It means, come back reasonably and talk about sort of what are the points of the reviews that you disagree with. Maybe there's points of misunderstanding, either where you weren't clear or the reviewers weren't clear. Maybe there's points where you can add experiments to fill gaps. Or maybe there's just kind of a message that's missing. But all of that is what we would discuss around this kind of post-decision process. Again, I'd sort of emphasize dialogue doesn't mean arguments, and the kind of goal here is either to help you figure out whether the revisions that you can do would make the paper a successful Neuron paper, or whether you should move on. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second, although I'm winding down. But the other thing I wanted to mention is just for accepted papers, even there, the process for the editors is not done. There's a lot that goes into post-acceptance processing. Sort of, we have a team of copy editors who will work on your paper. We spend time commissioning press releases and previews, work on the website, and sort of do a lot to kind of give your paper a lot of visibility. So when you have that decision letter, as you're trying to decide sort of what to do with it, I wanted to give you kind of a couple pointers to think about. And these are probably things that could be true for any journal. The first is to read the decision letter and the reviews really carefully, and to kind of do it in a state of less kind of emotional anxiety than I think most people are bringing to that first letter. That's a hard thing to do, and often it means stepping away from the letter. So what are the issues that the reviewers are raising? Do they relate to specific technical points? Are they saying something about their impression of advance or significance? Are there differences of opinion that you have with the reviewers, or are there just fundamental misunderstandings? Stepping back, maybe thinking about what they're saying scientifically and not getting too obsessed with either tone or just perceived tone. So if reviewers are kind of telling you that there's certain limitations, and if you sort of do agree with that, even though that you disagree about whether neuron's appropriate, you should sort of take that into account. If there's big misunderstandings, if it's one reviewer who's misunderstanding your paper, that's one thing. If it's 3 reviewers that are misunderstanding your paper, it's probably you, and that's something else. Are there issues in the reviews that need clarification? So are there things that you're confused about that an editor might help you be able to sort out? Do you think that you can address the reviews and resubmit? And so for any of those things, whether it's clarification or trying to sort of figure out in a concrete way what the next steps are, you should definitely contact an editor. And so here, again, Cell Press, this is something that we're putting a lot of time into. I don't doubt, I think that there are other journals where this is not what they're spending their time on, for better or worse. And so, don't be surprised if you try to call or email an editor another journal like, well, we don't consider appeals. I mean, there's definitely journals who don't. So I think it's one of those things that you just have to think about when you're submitting. I do think you need to think about when to appeal a decision. I mean, I don't think it makes sense to appeal every decision. Sometimes it's just best to move on. And, in the long run, with an editor, you don't want to be the author who appeals every decision. At the end of the day, there are times when the decision just needs to be respected. Here, I think it can often be really helpful to have a colleague, again, somebody who's maybe more on the outside, perhaps a little bit more kind of personally distant from the work, and maybe somebody who's senior, who's seen a lot of these letters and a lot of these reviews, who can give you a sense of just what your likely prospects are and sort of what approach would be best. And especially for young people, I'd say that that's a really important thing to do, because definitely senior folks, they've just seen a lot, and they're a little bit more hardened and a little bit more objective to some of the things that can come off as very personal. And I know that that can be a hard thing. I mean, if you got reviews that you feel like are very critical, you don't necessarily want to be sharing them with your department chair, but just kind of think about the value that you can still get from that outside point of view. If you've decided that you do want to appeal this decision and potentially try to come back to the journal, I mean, one of the first things we're probably going to ask you for is a point-by-point response. So all that means is that you would go through the reviews and write for each of the points how you would respond to it, whether you have a clarification or whether you have data or whether you in principle could get data. And that's the kind of thing that you would include with a resubmission anyway, but at this stage, it still has value even if you haven't completed all of the experiments. And typically, you would contact us by email, and we might then set up a phone call, but more or less in every circumstance, we're going to say, can we see your point by point? Because otherwise, it's a little hard for me to kind of get a good handle on what you're thinking before we talk, and most of us are handling 30, 40 papers at a time that we can't necessarily even remember your paper. It just helps us kind of frame the work before we have the phone call. The last thing I wanted to mention here is just the other option that we have at Cell Press is we have options for transferring papers. So that works between all the journals. So we do regularly receive transfers from Cell. So a paper might have gone through review at Cell. Maybe it got strong technical reviews, but it didn't make the cut in terms of advance. We could often work with those reviews at Neuron. Obviously, if you got reviewed at Cell and you got negative technical reviews, probably you don't want to transfer those reviews to Neuron. We probably would want to get either new reviewers, or you might want to think about going elsewhere. And for Neuron, I mean, kind of popular places for us to transfer papers are Cell Reports and Current Biology. And the same kind of thing where maybe it's gone through review at Neuron, it did pretty well, doesn't have to be a perfect set of reviews, but maybe it just fell short of the bar of significance. Often we can transfer those papers to Cell Reports or Current Biology, sometimes without any additional review, and so that's a really strong option. And then to close out, this is my kind of final list of Katja's musings on publishing and beyond, sort of big tips. And these are sort of less process-oriented and kind of just more having sort of thought about what it's like to be an editor and work with authors and what I like with working with certain authors. So one is to kind of consider your interactions with the journal as hopefully kind of the beginnings or a part of a long-term engagement. You're probably not going to submit just one paper to any one journal. You're probably going to submit lots of papers to that journal. And so I think you want the journal, as you get to know the journal and the journal gets to know you, you just want to act responsibly. So as a reviewer and as an author, act ethically, meet your commitments. You don't want to be that author that, when your paper comes in, the editor's like, oh, that's going to be a tough one because, he or she argues every single time, or, that's the reviewer who's always late, or, oh, that's the reviewer who always, chews up the paper and doesn't say anything positive. So you just kind of keep that in mind. And to kind of extend that further, this is sort of less sort of publishing-oriented advice, but kind of career advice, is, think about that for all your professional relationships. So for your program officer, for your grants, or even the people in your lab, or your administrative staff, or the people who work around you, your reputation matters. And I think, science is, at the end, sort of a people process, and you want people to kind of respect you and want to work with you. And so sort of keep that in mind as you kind of navigate the world. This point that I tried to make throughout the talk of being a consumer about where to submit your work, matching your paper to the right journal, balancing your portfolio of publications. Few of us can have every single paper from our labs be a nature paper, and so really think about that. When's the time to submit to one journal versus the other? Get feedback from your colleagues, and especially from people outside your lab, and from people across your field. I think too often we hold our work very close, sort of out of, I think, fear and paranoia, and I guess I would encourage you to be brave and talk about your work and sort of see what the advantages of that are. A big one, this could be a whole other talk, but one that I would put out there as something I think the whole field is going to have to wrestle with more, is managing collaborations. Pretty much every paper that comes to Neuron these days is a collaboration. And you're probably all involved in collaborations. And as editors, we often see kind of when things go south and there's a lot of collaborators involved, it can get really ugly really quickly. So, think about laying out some parameters for your collaboration. You should know who your co-authors are. When you are an author on a paper, every single one of those authors is responsible for the paper. If that paper runs into ethical issues, has a need for retraction, we don't retract one author, we retract the whole paper. So you should be thinking about that. It's of course not going to be true if you have collaborators who are helping you on technical areas that you don't have expertise in. You're not necessarily going to always be able to evaluate their data directly, but you should have a sense of sort of how much do you trust them, how much does the field trust them. And I think this is becoming more and more important because there's more and more attention being paid in the field, correctly so, to issues around ethics and reproducibility and reliability. And too often I've seen this sort of when things go down and you're the innocent on the paper, that it affects you just as much as the person who's responsible for what the problem might be. Related to that, be aware of ethical guidelines and best practices in your field. I think too often people, when something happens, will say, well, I didn't know, or, oh, no one ever told me that, or I didn't learn that. Well, it doesn't work that way. I think it's your job to educate yourself. So PIs need to mentor their students and postdocs, and students and postdocs, you need to educate yourselves. Shockingly, record keeping in most labs is kind of abysmal. And sort of, I think, especially for new PIs, you have a real opportunity to kind of set a different environment, and the importance of record keeping, laboratory best practices, the importance of lab culture, and kind of issues around sort of data reproducibility and ethics are going to become more and more important. They're really under a microscope right now out there, not just for publishers, but for funders as well. So if you're a PI, your role is as kind of a leader of the group to sort of set the tone around, not just science, but around ethics. And I would kind of encourage you all to sort of start discussing these things and think about best practices and ways of sort of enforcing those in the lab. I assume that in Europe there's probably more discussions about data reproducibility as there are in the US, but I think this will become a bigger issue as we go forward. And that's it. I went a bit over time. That was my end. And so I'm glad to take questions now or informally after.